It's time to get started. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's another beautiful Sunday morning. It actually is starting to feel like fall or winter if you're from Florida. And it's not supposed to warm up today, I don't think. I don't know, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. I personally enjoy it. We got to cash in on these days while we can. I just spent all of what I'm sure was Tim's wonderful sermon back in Faith Lane with 14 kids this morning. So this is a very welcomed elevation of maturity and level this morning, I'm sure. 14 kids is a lot, but that's a good problem to have. It's a step in the right direction. We're going to be continuing our study on unsung heroes of the Bible this morning, and we're going to pick up a little bit after where we left off last week. We talked about the 300 soldiers that fought with Gideon. We know nothing about any of their names. We don't know anything about many of them individually at all, except for the fact that they were very faithful in their ability to follow Gideon, to follow God, and allow themselves to be utilized by God for something very incredible, and to give God the credit for it as well, quite by design. This morning we're going to talk about two people, actually, two different stories, two different unsung heroes, if you will. Oh, Monica, you're throwing me all off. You're sitting way back. All right, no, that's fine. That's fine. It's all right. It's all right. Just as long as you can hear me, that's all. All right. Well, that's the perfect intro right there. We're going to be talking about two different people today. And so before we do that, I want to ask a question, a little bit of an icebreaker to get you guys thinking a little bit along the lines of where we're going today. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you thought, I should say something here, but then you don't? Or maybe somebody's, giving the old, do I have something in my teeth kind of thing? And, no, you're fine. It's okay. After the third or fourth time they try to get rid of it. It's really easy sometimes in those scenarios to kind of dismiss it. It's almost excusable to dismiss some things. Maybe somebody at work has been, taking the credit for your work, and you could see them going in the wrong direction, but you say, you know what, I'm going to let them figure that out the hard way. We all can be a little petty like that. Sure.
I was just ready to tell Martha where Tim is sitting up ahead of her. I said, no, I must be out.
Well, it's real difficult to pick guys like me and Tim out of a crowd. Just follow the shine. But yeah, so there are situations that we all recognize, sometimes comically, sometimes more seriously, where we probably should say something, but it's real easy to not step up and say something in those instances. We can definitely find a way out of it if we want to. It's easy to sit back and convince yourself someone else will intervene, or someone else will surely say something, or maybe it's not my responsibility to point out everything, or maybe pointing that out is not in my best interest. Does this outfit look flattering on me? That's a loaded question. We all know that, right? And even when the right answer is the right answer, there's always some distrust in it. There are situations where it's easier for us to not speak than to speak. Today we're going to look at two unsung heroes, two different stories involving two different interactions with two different prophets. Something unique about this story this morning, we're going to be looking at two women. And I'm going to go out on a limb this morning and say that no one in here has ever heard the names of these women before. And you're thinking, I've read the Bible. I'm pretty astute. I've probably heard these names. But you're wrong, because we don't know their names. We know them because of what they did and because of what they were, as opposed to knowing them by name. And so we're going to take a look this morning at two very unassuming women in the Bible. And don't get me wrong, there's no shortage of unknown or unsung women throughout the pages of the Bible, or throughout the pages of history for that matter. But today we're going to look at these two very unassuming women who made huge impacts on the people around them. And hopefully we're going to learn something from their example. The first story that we're going to find, if you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles, is going to be in 2 Kings. So if you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 2 Kings in chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5 and verses 1 through 15 is where we find the story of Naaman, who was healed of leprosy. Now, we talked a couple weeks ago about the 10 lepers that were healed, and we talked about what an ominous thing it meant to have leprosy in the time of the Bible. It was a death sentence. When we talked about the 10 lepers, about how rare it was for someone to be healed of leprosy, we're going to look at an instance a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 years before those 10 lepers, at another instance where a leper was healed this morning, and that was Naaman. So we're going to pick up in verse 5, 2 Kings chapter 5, and say, chapter 5, verse 1. Now Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. And he was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now just here in these first verse, there's some interesting things in there for us to kind of learn about this story. Naaman was a commander in the army of Aram. Aram was at odds with God's people. But what do we know about Naaman? We said that the Lord had given victory to Aram because of Naaman. Anybody find that interesting? It's hard for us to think about our enemies finding favor with God, isn't it? Think about that for a minute. Can you think of a modern day scenario where we struggle with the idea that our enemies might not necessarily always be God's enemies? There's a lot of shaking of heads. Anyone want to go out on a limb here and share something that they can think of? Apparently not.
Well, I can think of in the past when I tangled with some guys that I shouldn't have, and it kind of taught me a lesson to behave myself a little better.
Yeah. I'll be the first to say, somebody cuts me off in traffic, smite him. Smite him. There's no reason for me to feel superior. I don't know anything about that person. But in that moment, good golly, they're my enemy. You know what? They're probably not making God too happy. Don't we fall into that trap? It's interesting that we see here in this story that even though this man was in charge of the army that essentially God had given dominion to take over, and we see this cycle all throughout the Old Testament where God has other nations rise up and take out the Israelites. But Naaman found favor in God. And so that's an interesting thing that we could very easily just read over and not stop to think about. But it's something that's worth thinking about. Picking up in verse 2, he says, Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel. And she was Naaman's wife's servant. She said to her mistress, If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he could cure him of his leprosy. So now we have this unnamed young girl who was a servant. It's a very nice way of putting thrown over her shoulder, taken away from her family and her people, and brought to a new strange land and forced into servitude. It's a little bit different when you think about what this word is really entitling. She was a slave. She was there against her will. She was taken away by bands of raiders, brought to the enemy of God's people, and forced to work. And she is forced to work, luckily for her, for Naaman's wife, who is at least a man that was somewhat honored by God here. So she finds herself maybe not in the worst of worst situations, but it's not good. It is not one that we would wish on ourselves or any of our enemies. And she takes this opportunity when she sees that her master's husband is having this life sentence, this terrible disease. She could very easily say, suits him. That's what you get for messing with God's people. You know what? You ran an army against God's people. You put the Israelites to the sword. You deserve it. 100%. That's what you're getting your just rewards. You know what? And I could almost feel justified in sitting there and kind of smiling about it and saying, well, serves him right. This young, nameless servant girl doesn't do that. What does she say here? In verse 2, she says, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Picking up in verse 4, Naaman went to his master, who is the king, essentially, and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means," the king replied to Aram, "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took from the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of leprosy." What's really happening here? First of all, I want to ask you guys, what is it that you see that's kind of odd here? What sticks out of this scripture to you? Because a couple of things stick out to me. Mr. Bush.
Number one, for me, you're trying to buy God's blessing.
Okay.
With all the silver and gold that you took, you can't buy God's blessings. It's a gift.
Okay. Yeah, he said that, this Naaman's first thought is, I can buy my salvation, which certainly is a fallacy that we can recognize this morning. What else is kind of odd to you about all this?
Well, he sent the letter to the king, but he was told there was a prophet that could.
Okay. Yeah, so Naaman goes to his king and he says, "Hey, look, my servant," which, does that not strike anybody as odd? That this little servant girl just says, "Hey, there's a guy, there's a guy back at my home that could have fixed this." And he doesn't even seem to question it. Now that shows you how serious of a disease this is. He's willing to investigate anything for a chance at a new lease on life. So it's a little odd that he would just take this little girl at her word, for starters. But two, he goes to his king, and his king, who has already routed the Israelites in battle at least once, and is sending raiders into the Israelite people to take them away, who has kind of the power and the position of authority to do what he wants with them, doesn't just say, "Okay, well, let's rally an army and let's go get this prophet." He sends a letter with all of these gifts to the king of Israel, which is interesting to me. I'm not sure exactly why he does that. It certainly seems like he has the power and the authority not to, but maybe he recognizes something in this too. Maybe God is at work in a way that we don't necessarily see right off. Bert.
Maybe those were gifts to the king, or maybe Naaman figured this guy's going to have to take some time to heal me, so I'm taking 10 sets of clothes. I'm taking gold and silver so I can be comfortable as possible.
Yeah,
That's what
it's possible.
just guessing.
Yeah, we assume that these are gifts, but maybe he's just going to travel in comfort. We certainly know he's not opposed to the idea of parting with it, but yeah.
Well, because we'll see soon, Naaman says something.
We're not going to get quite that far in the story this morning, but but you're right, yes.
What I find interesting, at that time, anybody with leprosy was usually kept apart from everybody else. Here we have a man who has it and is of the king's army and is in contact with him and
Well,
all of those people.
In Israel, he definitely would have been unclean and unwelcome, despite having all of the stature that he had. Yes? So we find him in this situation where, he packs up and he brings all this stuff. Maybe it's partly for his own comfort. Maybe it's partly because he's wanting to be prepared for anything. But he heads off to see the king of Israel, not the prophet, which is another important thing to point out. And so he comes to the king of Israel, not saying, "Hey, we hear you've got a prophet over there that can heal this one," but, "Hey, I'm sending you my servant, go ahead and heal him." How do you think that the king of Israel is going to take that? Seems almost like a test, doesn't it? Let's pick up in verse 7 and we'll see. It says, "As soon as the king of Israel read this letter, he tore his robes and said, 'Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy?'" See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me? And I don't necessarily blame the king of the Israelites for this. This is a guy who's already been picking on them, who's already been fighting them, who's already been raiding them and savaging and pillaging his villages. Now he's just kind of doing it this is like mental warfare almost. So the king tears his robes. He's really upset about this. Does it strike any of you as odd that his first thought isn't, "Well, I should inquire of God"? Who should I inquire of God through? If only there's a prophet. The same guy that this little girl already knew about and had faith in. Don't you think that the king should have directly gone to the prophet? The prophet we're talking about is Elisha. And so when he hears that the king is upset and distraught, starting in verse 8, it says, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him a message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the men come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him to say, go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. In verse 11 it says, but Naaman went away angry. Naaman went away angry, and he said, I thought that he would surely come out and stand by me, call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hands over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Parphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? And so he turned off and went away in a rage. It's almost bipolar, isn't it? What do you think about this? Give me some thoughts that you have when you see the way that Naaman reacts to this.
Similar to us, he expected his blessing to come in the form he was expecting it.
Okay.
Instead of receiving it in the form that it came.
We talked several weeks ago about the centurion who told God, don't bother coming to my house. I'm not worthy of it. You have the authority. You say it to be done, it'll be done. This man, Naaman, should, by all accounts, understand that. But he doesn't. He expects the pomp and circumstance. He expects the show. Mr. Bush, did you have something you wanted to add?
Naaman, in that time, was a big man. And when you're a big man in authority, you expect big things to happen.
Okay.
And that's what he thought. He thought something big and spectacular was supposed to happen, where it's the small things in life that means a lot.
Well, if he's traveling with all this gold and silver, he's willing to pay for a big show. Now we see he expects one. And when God responds to him through the prophet in a way that he doesn't expect, and the way that he doesn't like, well, he gets a little angry. Anybody relate to that? A lot of times we expect God to act in big, powerful ways on our behalf. And a lot of times God responds in ways that are not necessarily the ways that we would have liked for him to respond. How do we deal with that when it happens? Do we get upset? Do we throw our hands up and say, well, it's not the way that I wanted it, so I'm better off without it? I'll go home with my leprosy instead of going over and dipping in this river. It's kind of crazy to think about. Jimmy?
I think when that happened, you should question God's love for me.
Okay.
You should question, did I do something wrong? Does he still love me? Because he didn't answer, he didn't give me the answer that I was looking for.
Yeah.
Did I do something wrong?
I think we definitely fall into that trap. We are definitely capable of mentally jumping through the hoops to say, hey, look, the rivers in my hometown are cleaner. Why do I have to go do this? Why do I have to lessen myself? Why do I have to travel all this way to dip in some dirty water? This could have been a lot easier for me. You know, God, you really didn't take my feelings into consideration here. What's the problem with that train of thought, with that perspective?
Being selfish.
It's being selfish, yeah.
No humility.
Yeah.
He showed no type of humility. He thought, I have all this possession, so you're supposed to clean me this way.
Yeah.
But he was in for a rude awakening when he said, no, go in the Jordan and dip 7 times. But he showed no humility. He was not obedient.
That's right. He definitely was not in that moment obedient. And we can certainly all probably relate to that as well. He's ready to go home. Jimmy?
Yeah, we want God to serve us. We don't want to serve God.
We would like God to serve us in a way that is convenient for us. You think you can make that happen? Just make it a little more convenient for me. That's not the way it works. That's not the way it's supposed to work. That's not even the way that's not even a thought that should enter into our minds. But because we are so comfortable here in our mortal coils, we fall into that trap really easily. We see Naaman fall into it as well this morning. So we're going to pick up and And we're going to start in verse 13. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed,' should you do it?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and he said, "Now I know there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept this gift from your servant." Now that story is going to go on to talk about that gift and some repercussions from that. I don't want to focus on, we know that story. I don't want to focus on that story this morning. I do want to talk a little bit about Naaman's change of heart, though, because we're told at the beginning of this story that Naaman is somebody that God found favor in. Do we know anybody in our lives that hopefully God's found favor in? Hopefully everybody that we encounter in our lives, God has found some favor in. He sacrificed his son for all of us. Are there times in our lives when, despite the fact that God has found favor in us, that we want God to interact with us on our terms instead of his? So we see Naaman go through this. We see Naaman take all of this into consideration, and we see that when he does, he still makes the wrong decision. He gets angry. He wants to take his ball and go home. Who is it that speaks up here? This is the humble servant. He has allowed himself to forsake his own humility, to build himself up into being an important person. And sometimes when we find ourselves in that situation, it takes the most humble of people around us to remind us of our own humility. And sometimes it takes the people in our lives, us, being a little humbled, to share that with them. Just to rewind back this story a little bit, as we found that small little servant girl this morning was able to find some humility and to share the good news, despite the fact that she wasn't going to gain anything from that. She stood nothing to gain. She probably stood everything to be taken from her had Naaman and his wife not wanted to hear it, or had he not had that faith, or had he come back home without being convinced to get in the river, right? She was still willing to sacrifice to her enemies, to the enemies of God, and allow herself and her humility to share. And that's a great lesson for us. Yes, Tim?
You talk about humility. The little girl says, the servant girl says, there's a prophet in Israel. And so Naaman comes, and Elisha says, "Tell him to come to me. I'll prove that there's a prophet in Israel."
Yeah.
He comes, and the prophet doesn't see him. He starts to leave, and his servants say, "Hey, if the prophet had told you to do something amazing, wouldn't you have done it?" So there's 3 times that everybody's kind of pointing to Elisha, but at the end, Naaman says, there is a God in Israel.
That's right.
So it's, Elisha's humility points this guy to God, not to himself, where everybody else is pointing to the prophet.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a great point in that when we allow ourselves to succumb to our humility in the presence of God, we won't be able to point anywhere else. There's no other power on earth so compelling as to allow us to deny every instinct of our human nature for something greater, for something divine. This little girl gets that. Here we see this little woman with a very mundane job. She's a maid, and what's more, the Bible singles her out as even a little maid. She is the lesser of the least. Yes, Jeannie? Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I get from this young girl, and we don't know how young she is. She might be a teen.
Sure.
She might be, but she's an informed girl.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody did a good job in teaching her about the prophets and about God, because when the time came, she knew what to say. And I think that's really great, and that's what we need to be doing with our kids. And,
Absolutely.
And, informing them and, training them in the way they should go.
Yeah.
So I thought she stepped up because she knew what to do.
She knew what was right. She'd been trained upright. Absolutely, we see that. She was a captive. She had been ripped away from God's people. She had been separated out, and pulled away and made to be less, she was essentially a slave to her enemies, and the people who she was sharing the good news with were her enemies. Think about that for a minute. They were her enemies. They were the people who took her from her family. Now, imagine some kind of dystopian future where some government power comes in and says, hey, look, we've been watching online. You guys were all in this auditorium on Sunday morning, and we watch on your digital devices are all pinging in at this location on Sunday mornings. We know you're a Christian. We're going to go ahead and get you guys all together and tear you off somewhere and put you in servitude to somebody else. Think about that. It's hard for us to even wrap our heads around that idea. But think about if we had done that, if we'd been pulled from our families, our children were separated from our loved ones and forced to be slaves for people who had not only done that, but had no problem and no qualms with doing that and continuing to do that. How many of you would be quick to share the good news with those people? Any show of hands? No? We would look at that and say, that's an excuse or a situation where I feel justified in not having to share this duty of sharing God's word. Okay, well, let's take that out of the equation. Let's just talk about the people who are in our lives. What's our excuse then? What's our excuse with not sharing with people? I mean, look, if this little girl can do that in the face of such overcoming tyranny, in the face of such evil, and she can still do that, shouldn't that shame us just a little bit? It should. It should shame us a little bit. Because the fact of the matter is, we have, whether we were raised in it or not, we have the upbringing to know good from bad. We have the upbringing and the ability to know that God has won the battle and that we are on the side that they want to be on. So what is to keep us from sharing? Yes, Mr. Bush.
If you look at this outside the box, from this little servant, she had everything to gain and nothing to lose. And she had faith. And so faith will take you a long way than anything else. And the other thing is that we can win the battle but lose the victory.
Yeah.
Because once the battle's over, we won it, we get complacent. And we don't want to do no more. And that's how the enemy sometimes sneak upon us and capture us. So she had more to gain, being from a low point standpoint, than naming himself. He's up there.
Yeah.
He has everything to lose.
You're absolutely right. So we examine the faith of this unknown woman. She witnessed to others the wonderful healing power of God. Is there anybody in your life that needs to know about the wonderful healing power of God? Are they your enemies or are they just acquaintances? Is there a reason that should stop you, that should impede you from sharing that news with them? So what is it that keeps us from doing it? If this little girl can do it and be an example to us, that should be empowering to us. Forget about the shame that we should feel. It should compel us to be better at it, because we should be better at it. It's what we're here for. I'm speaking to myself included. So, of course, it's another example of thinking, so we also, just take 1 second, because we're going to move on to somebody else in another story. It's worth pointing out, too, and we did as we kind of went through the story, that the king of Israel, too, had his doubts. When he had this letter and this man in front of him, he didn't seek out God first. So we all, no matter where we are in our walk with God, wherever we are in our walk as Christians, or walk as human beings, we find ourselves in different places. We always have to be able to remember to be humble before God, to recognize who it is that's in charge, and to see the bigger picture, because when your enemy is in front of your face, if you don't see the bigger picture, you will not be able to see God. You will not be able to point to God in that position. So we learn about the humility of this young servant girl. We don't know her name. We only know that she was willing to take a stand and to share about the healing words and news of a prophet, a man of God, somebody who could change that man's life, give him a new lease on life. We have that same message. We know of the man who came, who was sacrificed, and who provided a way to give us a new lease on life, to allow us to be full recipients of the healing power of God. And so we can learn from this girl. Let us not forget that we're all here because of a legacy of millions of people who have come before us that were willing to share God's word. Sometimes it was uncomfortable. In fact, probably a lot of times it was uncomfortable. But because they were willing to share that word, there was a legacy passed down through the generations that allowed each and every one of us individually to be here this morning. They didn't let themselves expire. They didn't leave this world without sharing that news with somebody else. We have that same responsibility and that same call, and we need to be better about it. We can follow the example of this girl. So remember this woman, she could have very well been just like any one of us. She was just an ordinary, everyday person who had faith in God. And her faith and her willingness to share, even with her enemies, even in a situation that was detrimental to her, should inspire us to do more for God's kingdom. She's an unsung hero, and the echo of her willingness to share continues throughout history. And it's an example for us. The second person we're going to talk about this morning, we're going to move over to 1 Kings. So you can flip back a little bit. 1 Kings chapter 17 and verses 8 through 24. And we're going to talk about another woman whose name we don't know, but we know her because of what she was and who she was. We're going to talk about the widow of Zarephath. This woman was a widow, and we're going to hear a little bit about her story this morning and how she was willing to use her faith to allow something much greater to happen because of her obedience to God and to a man of God. Starting in verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him, this is Elijah, and it said, "Go to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I've directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I might have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord our God, your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Stop and think about that for a minute. Now, what we don't necessarily know from what we're reading this morning is that this is during a time of great famine in the land. There's not a whole lot to go around. And this woman is preparing her final meal when the prophet shows up. And then God tells us that he directed Elijah, that this woman was instructed to supply him with food. But when he has this conversation with her, we don't see her saying, "Oh yeah, I was expecting you coming." So it's a little interesting here about what the expectation is. But we're going to see that she is faced with an impossible task here. Because in verse 13, Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. You're making your last meal to feed you and your son before you die. Don't be afraid." That doesn't even enter the equation for me. If your family is at death's door and someone's saying, "Hey, yeah, you're making your last meal. Hold on a second. Get me some water and don't be afraid." What would you think? It takes a lot of courage to even suggest something like that. But the man of God tells her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make me a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son." He just took it up another notch, didn't he? What are you thinking if you're this woman?
Get lost.
Go pound sand. Yeah. Hey, I just told you that I'm making my final farewell meal, and you're like, "Let me have some of that." Actually, you know what? Feed me first. I'll take as much as I want from it, and then we'll see what you got left. Now, that's not exactly what Elijah's doing here, but at the same time, what a tremendous amount of faith, one, to ask that, and two, for her to even consider it. How many of us would consider that? Okay, you take food from me, that's one thing. You take food from my kids? Really? Let's start up, and then in verse 14, he follows it up, and he says, "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." And so she went away and did as Elijah had told her. That's a simple sentence, but that is a very complex sentence. How many of us would have had the faith to do something like that? Oh, the handful of flour I've got's not going to be gone when I make this bread? Oh, the little bit of oil that I have left is just going to magically reappear? Well, the answer is yes. But who has that faith? At death's door, yes.
Especially since she didn't even know him.
Well, so we are told that God said that he was going to, that God said he was preparing her, but we don't necessarily know what that preparation looked like. But yeah, still, even still, how much faith does that take? It's a tremendous amount of faith. In verse 15, she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food for every day for Elijah and the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. So we do see that the man of God made good on that. And then my first question, and probably what we see, with the Israelites in the wilderness, then you start wondering, all right, how long before they started complaining about just having bread? That's the humanistic way about it. Yeah, Bert.
This is really just semantics, but you just said what kind of faith did that take? Thank you, Gary. But what kind of obedience was it? I have to think that she was more obedient than full of faith. Because later on, she finally comes back and says, your God is God.
That's true. That is true.
She's obedient.
She's definitely obedient.
That's what we need to be. And then God reveals himself.
Our faith will be strengthened through obedience. There's no question about it. Now, there is an element of faith in being obedient, but it's only going to become strengthened by God when we see that we do allow that obedience to take place. Because something does happen later on. And we see in verse 17, sometime later, we don't know exactly how long, but sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house had become ill. And he grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, what do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Give me your son, Elijah replied, and he took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where she was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? Then he stretched himself out over the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, let this boy return to his life. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, Look, your son is alive. Then the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Now certainly, having our child saved would embolden that faith. But it is interesting, as Bert said, that she waits until this moment, sometime later. We don't know how long, but think about the fact that they're subsiding on a very meager diet of bread and water in a time of famine, where if you get sick, there's not any hearty soup that's going to help you here. Her son is essentially wasting away and not being able to become better and falls death to this illness. You have here a woman of great faith and obedience, and yet we still don't know her name. We only know her as a widow. This is somebody that Elijah spent a fair amount of time with, a long time. He lived in her house. He ate from her meager portions of food. But at no point in time does she kind of merit someone saying, hey, yeah, and by the way, this is her name. And this is what she did to keep the man of God alive. We do learn some of that, but it is kind of glazed over. Yes, Jeannie?
I think that this woman was a Gentile, and that town was supposed to be really wicked.
Yeah.
And he sends, after feeding him in the desert and giving him water, he sends him there, and he went a long way. So Elijah was pretty wasted, probably himself. But I think God somehow, Elijah had enough reputation in these areas to have been heard of
Yeah.
some. So she knew that the Lord your God, you know, she knew about that. So she knew that he had the Lord his God would do something.
The timing in this story is very interesting. Elijah is sent to this woman at a time when he needs what she's got. He is in a situation that's not good. He is in a time and a surrounding and a place full of famine and pestilence, and there's nothing good. He finds this woman when he needs her the most. And she finds him as she is making her last meal for her and her son at a time when she needs Elijah the most. And more importantly than all of that, they both find each other at a time when they both need God the most. They need God. And they needed perhaps each other and their own testaments to faith to strengthen each other. They needed their own examples of obedience to strengthen each other in that time. Yes, Fadia?
I think this happens to us too in our lives, that we meet people that are there to strengthen us, and we need each other to grow. And I think God put these people in our lives for that purpose.
And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that is really well played out when we look at the scripture, because both the prophet and the woman had demonstrated amazing faith. But when things got bad, when her son died, if you notice when you read, they both make a point of blaming God for that death, which is a little weird. Not necessarily in a shaking your finger at God way, but like, God, why are you really allowing this to happen? What do we learn from that in our lives? Even when we surround ourselves with the right people, when times of crisis and trouble are at their worst, we have to be even more vigilant in our obedience and our faith to God, or else we can cause ourselves to stumble. We talked about that when we talked about Barnabas and the importance of encouragement, even and especially in those hard times. It is all the more important that we encourage each other, that we keep that focus on the blessings and the good things that God does for us in those times. They both fell into that trap a little bit. It just goes to show that all of us can have our weaker moments, yet we can still be faithful and obedient to God despite our weaknesses and our doubt, and in spite of them. Yes, Mr. Bush.
The Bible tells us we're going to suffer trials and tribulation.
Mm-hmm.
And during that point in time that we're suffering our trials and tribulation, that's the time we need more faith than ever, because faith can overcome. Jesus, our spiritual example, he had what? Trials and tribulation.
Yeah.
And he overcame. So if we're following Jesus, we should have the same attitude that, hey, look, I'm going to deal with this. Instead of saying, why not me? Okay, woe is me.
Yeah.
Who are we to not to suffer?
Yeah.
If the Son of God suffered, so who are we?
Yeah. No, it helps put things in perspective for sure. Yes. Oh, no. Okay. Well, we're running out of time, so I do want to just say that I want to point out the widow had faith to rely on God, and once again, we see another nameless person in faith who stepped out, who was obedient, who was willing to put literally everything. I mean, we're talking, she was prepared to die. She put everything at risk for her and her son to be obedient to a man of God. And God blessed them both through that and continued to sustain them and keep them alive, just like we talked about Caleb, who was sustained and kept alive by God to fulfill his purpose. All of these people have these elements, these characteristics that really seem ordinary. But when we can utilize them and when we really allow God to utilize them, become extraordinary things. And so when we look at the small servant girl, the willingness to share in servitude, in the face of our enemies, we can learn from that. The obedience and the willingness to put others first and to allow, to trust and have the faith in God to provide is a tremendous example for us that we can glean from, and two wonderful examples of unsung heroes in the Bible. We'll be back next week to pick up on one more. I thank you for your time this morning. Sorry we went a little bit over. So if you got kids in the back, go get them.